Hey guys, so I've unfortunately caught a parasite, so I'm stuck at home until the diarrhea works its way through my system. And usually in these cases, you just have to stay hydrated and close to a close to a bathroom. And in any case, since I'm at home, I actually ended up looking on the online and just watching mainly Netflix. But I happened to see this video, and I thought I'd just talk about it a little bit more. And let me go ahead and play it for you. It's only a couple of minutes long.
Problem with socialism, in the words of Margaret Thatcher, at a certain point you run out.
So Meghan McCain is the daughter of a Vietnamese, an American POW that was shot down, I believe, in Vietnam. And he ended up marrying a very successful woman who has millions of dollars. And the result is Meghan McCain. And she is a Republican. And this is the Conservative Party in the U.S. But my point is, in mentioning these labels, is just to tell you that this is somebody who's had the benefit of probably the best education and two of the best parents you could possibly hope for.
Out of spending other people's money. Venezuela, one of the richest countries in the world in the 70s. Now, the average Venezuelan has lost 24 pounds because they're starving to death. 90% of the country is living in poverty.
I think she's talking more about Scandinavia than Venezuela.
I'm sorry. This is what I need from her. Name one country that socialism has ever worked, and also every democratic socialist who is going on TV saying that it's good needs to start paying 90% in taxes.
Iceland.
On your tax form. On your tax form, I think you should start paying the amount of taxes that every socialist in this country thinks you need to. Because if you think the government is so good at spending money, look at the VA.
No,
because it is dangerous.
I just told you several countries that do it.
I'm sorry.
Hold on a minute.
Hold on, everybody. God bless you all.
I hate that bell.
I know you hate the bell. Then everybody stop talking over each other, and I won't hit the bell.
The population of 300,000 people in no way can be related in any way comparably to the United States of America. I'm sorry. If you think it's good, then you need to be paying the amount of taxes
Let her get her thing and go ahead.
Because it's petrifying to me that this is being normalized.
All right, go ahead.
So, you're saying you run out of people's money,
Margaret Thatcher.
Other people's money, Margaret Thatcher.
I didn't say that.
They have just given this enormous tax break to the very, very wealthy in this country. That tax break doesn't have to be so generous to those really rich people, does it? Because if you don't give that money to them, what happens to that money? Better schools, better post office,
I'm sorry.
better garbage pickup, better
If you think the government is so good at running things, then the post office is a great run business. The VA, I'm sorry, comparing the United States of America to a small country in Europe is delusional. And I'm sorry, some of us do not want socialism to be normalized in this country.
I am an example. Can I finish my thing?
70%.
Okay, let's talk about this very quickly. All of us are now dumber for having watched that. And the reason is because there's no context. So let's just go through a couple of quick points. Number one, they mention, let's get the easy ones out of the way. Norway. Norway has access to, I believe, a hundreds of billions of dollars in an oil fund. So Norway, I'm just typing with one hand, so excuse me here. Sovereign Wealth Fund. And so it actually has here we go. Top headline, $131 billion. $1 trillion. The return. So in other words, for doing nothing, the Norwegians get $131 billion a year. Now, it's because the stock market has gone up as well as oil prices. The public-private oil company called Statoil, symbol is STO, essentially just gives the country free money every year. And this is sort of interesting because let's see, it's $1 trillion. So and they don't even have to touch the principal. I don't know what the population of Norway is. Probably 10 million. Who knows? 5 million. So again, you're getting $151 billion a year because you have a government that has a ton of money, and so you cannot compare. Ultimately, that's number one. So it's a very unique situation, not only because of a small population. A lot of countries have small populations. They're certainly not doing as well as Norway. And in fact, the Norwegians are importing Swedes to do a lot of work now because they are still rich. They don't necessarily have to work jobs that they don't want to do anymore. The other examples that were mentioned, I believe, were, let's try to think about this for a second here. Sweden, again, small population, because it's right next door to a neighbor that is booming. It's got the best of all possible worlds. So very difficult to make comparisons here. But Sweden is also an interesting point because they actually ended up, they're not as socialist as you might think. They do not have the same sovereign wealth fund as Norway, just simply because of a botched treaty. In the treaty negotiations where Norway appears to have hoodwinked Sweden in carving out a territory post, I believe it was World War II or something else or some other event. But essentially Norway knew there was oil, and when they drew the map establishing borders, made sure that the oil was on their side. Now Sweden has an old age pension fund similar to what's called Social Security, and what's interesting about this is that it actually caps. And what ended up happening was it was paying out too much money, and so what ended up happening was relative to the population, because the population, the younger population, was simply not catching up to the older population, and the demographics were making it very difficult. So to pay out the entitlements, and so what ended up happening was they linked it, I believe, to GDP. And GDP is simply, did the economy grow? Did it stagnate? And if it stagnated, then they made sure that the pain was suffered by across the board. And whereas in America you might say, why are you making grandma pay for this? The idea here is you're one country and we're going to make sure that we all are in the same boat. Now, whether that's socialist or not, that attitude, I'm not, again, it's very difficult to come up with a definition, and we'll get back to that later on. I'm trying to find something here where, here we go. And actually, Google has gotten a little bit better. This is actually a state country website. Decreased slightly in relation to GDP. It doesn't prove what I was saying, which was that they changed the system. And if you try to do this on your own, you'll see that reduction benefits GDP. Let's try to see if that works. Because they changed the system and changes. Here we go. So they actually ended up increasing the upper limit. So I think actually, surprisingly, that was the one. So they actually changed it. And this is an interesting situation, but I don't want to go through it right now because we want to cover a lot of other topics. And so they mentioned Sweden. What else did they mention? When you go back here, they mentioned quite a few other things. But what's really interesting is this idea that on the other side, where you have, I think, Miss Bihar, she was the one that was speaking to the Meghan McCain, was saying that, if you just give this money to you'll automatically have better schools. Well, that's not actually true. We all know if you just pay people who are in existing positions more money, it's not necessarily true that suddenly things get better. The morale might certainly go up, but that does not necessarily mean services go up as well, or that there's any more innovation. Simply paying people more money in and of itself does not lead to any sort of change. And we know this because California they passed a proposition making sure that at least K through 14 schools, that would be primary, secondary, and also community college, would receive a certain minimum level of funding, at least 40% of the entire budget. So minimum annual funding level in community colleges, also known as K through 14. And this is a fantastic site, by the way. It's nonpartisan, similar to the federal office, I think called the GAO, except in this case it's called the LAO. And so ultimately it worked out that, here we go, currently Proposition 98 spending, the amount of money that goes into, from the general fund that goes into schools would be 45%. So the test one means you have to, actually not 40%, 39%. But from what I've seen here is that ultimately a lot of Californians don't know this. They think that K-12 and K-14 funding has gone down. It's actually stayed pretty constant over time because of this proposition, which mandates a minimum 40 or 39% or more, and this is all the way back in 2005. So since then, I don't think anybody can claim that schools have suddenly gotten better in California, even if there has been a more consistent revenue stream that, again, is in many cases is over 50% of the entire funding with the general fund in the budget. So, it's also just complex, right? You have demographics, you have all these other factors, none of which were discussed. If you have segregation, which is still a massive problem, right? In Northern California, when I was volunteering in secondary schools, only about a 20-minute drive from my neighborhood, I thought I saw maybe one Caucasian student, and mostly students of color, which is shocking because it's precisely what the Supreme Court overturned, this segregation in Brown versus Board of Education. And it's still there, which indicates that for the most part, number one, laws and Supreme Court decisions don't often have any impact, despite the best intentions of the people, the lawyers, and judges. And oftentimes, it really is an issue of where the money is going. That's why Bihar is making that argument. She's saying that if it's about the money, you go ahead and increase the money and things get better. But again, that's only one part of the pie. Of course, if you have higher wages, you can attract better people, but that takes a long time to change entire systems. So that's just a couple of things here now. But I want to discuss overall, number one, the fact that we have very, very rich and smart people on that panel, and none of them are able to really give you any context. The entire thing it's sad, simply because you have a situation where none of it really enlightens anyone. And these people went to the best schools. And sorry, these are just some travel photos. I'm trying to find here we go. I'm trying to find something where I was reading a book that about history, and it really does talk about a very, very interesting situation where, World War II was a crazy, crazy time. You had Japanese against Russians, people switching sides. You had the Germans invading the Russians. You had the Japanese and the Germans collaborating. The Japanese should have won had they managed to, sort of communicate better among their different outposts. You had forced slavery. You even had a situation where the founder of Singapore was captured by the Japanese, and essentially being forced to do manual labor, and became a POW. Ironically, right? Because we just saw the daughter of an American POW, and she's discussing this very complex movement that resulted, because Vietnam, obviously was a communist country. It's the Communist Republic of Vietnam, I think. Actually, I'm not sure what the full name of Vietnam is. I know it's Vietnam, but we know it's a communist country. So ultimately, we're in a position where you have an extremely complex situation, and you can see here where you've got the British on one side, you have the communists actually helping the British because the Japanese were able to kick them out of Singapore, and because of the help of the communists, mostly Chinese. This is Perry's book on Singapore, published back in 2017. And you had a situation where the British then betrayed the communists that were fighting on their side, and went ahead and established another outpost in order to placate their other outposts in Australia and New Zealand, giving you an idea of just how powerful these ports were, primarily because almost all trade happens based on it happens on the sea, 90%. And I also found out that the internet connections are now done based on fiber optics that are designed underwater now, giving you another element of why the sea is so powerful and why naval power, whether it's British, Spanish, or Portuguese, has been has managed to make countries much bigger than what they really should have been relative to population. And it really did come down to the power of the Navy. And that's going to change now as countries build a new Silk Road, as China becomes less and less pleased with this idea that its empire and its ports, which are now almost all in the top 10 worldwide in terms of volume, might be dependent on a foreign power's protection. But I want to again explain this because this is obviously complex. And I didn't know until recently that there's a difference between socialists and communists. In many cases, they were against each other. But you have all these shifting allegiances going on, and it's very important to mention when you're speaking about socialists or communists. It's just a label. It doesn't actually mean anything unless you know the history behind it. And the history behind it, and I'm no historian, is massively complex. And it really deals with the idea that communism back in the day was a threat to foreign power. It was actually, the idea was that foreign powers would then project their influence into your country. And that's why McCarthy was able to get all the help he did, simply because he was in a position where he had allegedly intel that said that all these people were coming into the U.S. And attempting to infiltrate the country and subvert it. And this is something that everyone blames McCarthy, and I really dislike the way history is taught, because it turns out the Supreme Court of the United States bought into it as well, and it's including a judge that's one of the most intelligent judges the United States has ever had, who usually stuck up for Robert H. Jackson, and this is way back in 1951, right before the turbulent 1960s, and you can see that. He says over here, the communist recognizes that an established government in control of modern technology cannot be overthrown by force until it is ready to fall on its own. And so, ultimately, the United States, fortunately, has experienced communism only in its preparatory stages, and for its pattern of final action, much like abroad. And again, you go back to Russia. And ultimately, you have a situation where, once again, it's so complex when we talk about these things like socialism and communism, but I think it's so important to see the background to all of this, the fact that McCarthy was not an isolated incident, the fact that all these, the fact that any movement, in order to be successful, has to better the circumstances, the economic circumstances of its people. And when people are relying on labels, it just doesn't go anywhere. And I'm very, 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 very saddened by the lack of historical context that I see everywhere around me, and I think that's one of the signs of an empire in decline. When you make comments without being open to discussion, and when you start making such broad-based comments that you're not able to really enlighten anybody, and especially when you come from a family with millions of dollars, where presumably, unlike an immigrant to the United States like myself, you should have had a better education. And somehow I'm the one that's able to see the context, and not the daughter of a POW and a multimillionaire.